Welcome, everyone. This is our 11th episode of the Ask CESO Communications webinar, and I hope you'll take a moment to go back and check out the other 10. So far, we've talked about websites, storytelling, crisis communications, branding, enrollment marketing, public engagement, graphic design, elections, strategic communication plans, and writing. But today, we are going to talk about financial communications. Let me tell you a little bit about who we are before we get started. We are the Center for Effective School Operations, or CESO, which provides support services to school districts. Most of us are on the communication team for this episode, but CESO also offers transportation, finance, HR, technology services, and adding more. So check that out as well. Justin, you want to join me?
Good morning. Happy lunch. It's noon. So
exactly.
How are you doing today?
Doing great, thank you.
Yeah, we're balmy 94 degrees here in Dallas, Texas. So we're already enjoying the heats of summer. So excited to be here today. Just so you know, for everybody watching, the format of this show, it's Q&A. This is a conversation. We have some questions that we fielded from clients. We also have questions that friends have sent us from School PR World. If you have a question, if you're watching live and you throw it into the comments on your YouTube channel, we'll be able to check those out backstage, send them in to get them answered. If you watch later when it's not live and have a question, feel free to email anybody on the CESO team and we'll get you an answer. I'm excited. This is a different kind of panel today. It's a bigger panel than we normally have. So I get to sit backstage as always, take notes. And if I have a question, maybe at the end, if we need one, I'll jump in and ask you a question. But let's go ahead and get our panelists in here and let's do some introductions.
I love it. Thanks, Justin. Okay, so first we're going to introduce our Vice President of the CESO Communications team, Bob Noyed, APR. He has more than 35 years of experience working in school districts as a strategic communications professional. Prior to joining us in 2019, he served as the Director of Communications for several Minneapolis area school districts. Alongside his district experience, Bob served as NSPRA president in 2006-2007, and as NSPRA's North Central Region vice president from 99 to 2002. He has also served 2 terms as the president of the Minnesota School Public Relations Association, or MINSPRA, and he was the 2005 recipient of NSPRA's Barry Gaskin's Mentor Legacy Award and received NSPRA's President's Award, which is its top award, in 2021. So, hi, Bob.
Good morning, or good afternoon. I'm stuck with Justin. I'm in the morning. Good afternoon.
That's right. All right, let's bring on Julie. Julie Thannum, APR, is a Senior Strategist for CESO Communications. She is accredited in public relations. She has more than 30 years of experience in school communications. She's a past TSPRA president, and she's a recipient of TSPRA's Bright Idea and Most Valuable Member Awards. She actually served 1 year as TSPRA's interim executive director. She's also a past NSPRA president and received NSPRA's highest award as well, the President's Award, in 2022. And she's been on our CESO Communications team since 2021. And I believe she also got the TSPRA President's Award recently as well. She and Justin did. Hi, Julie.
Hi, and Bob.
Yeah, Bob got that one too.
So.
Yeah, you both did, exactly.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Exactly.
You got to add that to the list.
That's right. We have an exciting additional guest this time. We have one of our CESO parent companies, co-CEOs, Ron Meyer, with us, co-Chief Executive Officer. Ron has worked in finance and operations for more than 15 years. His school career began in transportation operations, where he held leadership positions in multiple school districts, including as the Director of Transportation at South Washington County Schools, one of the largest in the state of Minnesota. He transitioned to school finance, where he has held both controller level and executive CFO or COO level roles in several districts. Ron has also owned and operated small businesses in the insurance and school operations spaces, and he served on the school board in his local community. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Communications and a Master of Business Administration from Bethel University. We love a communications degree.
For sure.
Thanks for joining us, Ron.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And I want to quick introduce Justin, who is the wind beneath our wings and makes this webinar happen from a technical side. Justin is a communication strategist for CESO Communications. He's a former educator. After 8 years of working in school communication departments in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Texas, he joined our team as a communication strategist in July of 2021.
Yes.
Yes. 2022.
Yes.
He has been recognized by NSPRA and TSPRA for his work in social media and video production, and he won the 2020 TSPRA Bright Idea Award for his podcast School PR Happy Hour, so go check that out. And as we mentioned, he and Julie and Bob recently won the TSPRA President's Award.
As always, I will introduce Nicole so she doesn't have to introduce herself because that's weird.
Thank you.
So Nicole is a senior strategist for CESO Communications. Before joining CESO in the fall of 2022, she was responsible for communications in a district in Kansas City, Missouri for 23 years. She served as INSPR president in the 2021-2022 school year and served as MOSPR president 20 years ago. She earned the INSPRA Gold Medallion, the INSPRA Frontrunner Award, the INSPRA Learning and Liberty Legacy Leader Award, and the MOSPR Professional of the Year Award, and the MOSPR Distinguished Service Award. That's the first time I've gotten through Learning and Liberty Legacy Award without messing it up in 4 or 5 episodes.
That is a mouthful. You are correct.
Well, friends, I'll get out of the way. I will throw some questions in. I'll be watching in the background, and I'll let you know if we have any questions come in, but have a great conversation.
Thank you, Justin. All right, let's jump right in to talk about financial communications. The rules vary from state to state about finances in schools, but wherever we're talking, it is complicated. So that often makes it hard for communities to understand. So Bob, can you start us off by talking about why it's important to clarify these complex financial issues for people?
Yeah, it's really about transparency. I think it's an opportunity. It's also an opportunity for the school district to present information that stakeholders need to know, parents, staff members, and just broadens and deepens, understanding. Oftentimes, when we think about finance, we say things like, "Well, it's really complicated," and then we stop there. We use that kind of as an excuse. It's complicated, and it truly is complicated. But that is, it's not a reason to stop. It's a motivation to continue, and it's an opportunity to keep sharing information and digging in and providing perspective that is really important for our stakeholders to understand all of the things that happen in schools. I think there's another opportunity here too, and it's been my experience, and I think it's often true that the school business official in the school districts is very often one of the most trusted voices in the school district community, and when that person speaks and shares information, people listen because there's such trust and confidence in that person. It's not universal. It's not always there, but it's been in my experience that it's often there. And using that voice, using that perspective, I think can be really powerful. And in some ways, as a communicator, it's our role to help those people communicate in a way to make the complicated simpler. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. But part of the communicator's role is to take a complicated message and make it more simple. So I think it's also a real important and great partnership for the business office folks and the communications office folks to really work together and partner and make a fairly significant difference in the school district.
That's a good point. And we'll go into that in a little more depth here in a minute. For now, Bob, what advice do you have for making those complicated financial issues more understandable?
Yeah, we really think about it in terms of kind of four issues: time, repetition, the layering of messages, and context. I'm going to talk about each one of those four things quickly. First of all, the notion of time, because these issues and this content is complex and it is complicated. We have to make sure that we allow enough time to communicate. We can't communicate just once and expect people to understand a complicated budget. We have to do it on an ongoing basis. It has to be not, don't just put the budget book on the website. Share information along the way so people can understand exactly what we're talking about. That feeds into the notion of repetition, of course, is to don't share it once, share it in a variety of ways over the course of time. So again, people get to see that and understand that information. The notion of layering is really about, I always use the example of you don't give someone a 64-page booklet or a 64-page budget and say, here you go, try to figure this out. You give them to them, pieces at a time. The first layer is so you build over time, and it builds people's perspective. It builds people's awareness and knowledge and understanding to kind of layer those messages and layer that content over time. And the final one is really is about context. And I like to think about from a financial communication perspective. If we think cost, that's content. That's something costs $4 million or $500,000. That's content. The context of that is starting to explain and starting to think about the value and the impact of those dollars. So it's not just our budget for transportation is $4 million. Well, most people, when they hear that number, they say, "Oh, wow, that's a big number." But as we provide context of that number, people start to understand what it means. Our budget, our transportation budget includes transporting, how many thousands of kids every year and how many bus routes, and you start to give context to those numbers, and it allows people to understand it in a different way. So, and again, a few examples, a $50 million budget. Well, that's a big number, but if we start to break those down, and there's other examples that you can use, but again, really thinking beyond just the cost and kind of emphasizing the value and the impact of those dollars will help our stakeholders and audiences to really understand more deeply what we're talking about.
Absolutely. You have talked before, Bob, a little bit about the difference between in terms of cost and content. Can you go a little deeper into that?
You mean the difference between cost and content? I mean, cost
is content. Yeah.
Yeah, cost is really the content that we're saying. I mean, here's the the information, and what I would say is the difference between content and context. Context gives you a little deeper understanding of what the content actually means.
Got it. Okay, Ron. In my old district, I partnered a lot with our assistant superintendent who was in charge of business. And it was a really good, healthy tension because I was pushing to make things more clear and he was pushing to make sure that they stayed accurate while I was clarifying. And so I was wondering, from your perspective as a school business official, what should districts remember about financial communication from that perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll start because I have that school finance lens on. I'll start with that accuracy piece. I think was mentioned earlier, just that trust factor with community. The quickest thing I think to break trust or to erode trust in a community is if they don't have accurate information. And I've seen this in a variety of different forms with school districts where the information that came out, either it was not accurate, meaning that new information came later that was different, or even the perception of inaccuracy, where questions are asked in the community, back to Bob's point earlier about the complication of, or the perceived complication of school finance, and the perception that information is accurate, it can also erode trust. So it's really important, I think, to make sure that the information is accurate, and that's, I think, a shared responsibility, certainly within the business office, but then also how do you present that information out, the actual financial information? Is it communicated in an accurate and accurate way as well, so that we're looking back, what did we communicate last time about similar information, and are we communicating in a similar way, and then addressing those perceptions of inaccuracy as well. I think consistency is also really important, and this is something that I think school districts, they will communicate at various points. So Bob mentioned putting the budget book on the website. We know in school finance that there's a regular rhythm to the year and regular focal points, and so sometimes we'll communicate on those big things, but that's kind of where the communication stops. So how do we continue as finance professionals to communicate out throughout the year? And a lot of school districts will have finance committees, and they'll maybe communicate out what's happening, some of that data, financial data, to that finance committee, but that's typically one subset of the community and stakeholder group. So how do you expand that and making sure that there's consistency in that communication throughout the year as well? I think there's also an element that is really important in kind of that accuracy versus getting the message out, and that's really understanding the why. And I think oftentimes for finance people in business office, it's all about the numbers, and we get really caught up in the numbers, and we don't necessarily draw the correlation to what those numbers mean in terms of what's actually happening. So how do you communicate out? And this is a great partnership with communication departments, between the finance department and communication departments, is how do you link that, the actual numbers, to how is it furthering, whether it's a strategic plan, a vision for the organization, or whatever else, but really helping stakeholders in the community understand, why are these numbers being spent or the revenue being driven? What does that actually mean in terms of impact on students and on learning and on the success of the school district? So I think really understanding the why is important. And then the final thing I think is, and finance people are notorious for this, is they have their own jargon, their own set of how do we speak to other finance people. And there's a ton of different concepts and terms that are utilized throughout the finance world. And some of it is similar to other finance spaces in industry or other industries. And some of it's unique, specific to school finance. But certainly anyone who doesn't have a finance background, those terminologies, that language can be really confusing. And so how do you make sure that, again, partnering up with communication department, how do you make things understandable? How do you define the jargon and the terminology so that it's palatable to a little bit more in terms of the message that you're trying to share?
That's a really good point. And what I think of when you say that is the experience that I had where we were talking about fund balance. And because that was a term that most people didn't know, they thought that they didn't realize we had this money, that this was reserves. And then talking about, related to the same conversation, a deficit budget. That's the proper accounting term, but it's not something that most people understand, and it made people think that we were using a credit card. So I think that having that balance between clarity and accuracy is so important. So thank you for that. Ron, we've talked a lot in communications about how communities don't like surprises. And you talked about how we need to be communicating consistently and not just at one time. So with that in mind, what are your thoughts about when we should be communicating about school finances?
From a finance perspective, as often as possible, right? I think it's so important for a variety of reasons, and I understand finance is a really big component, and how do you balance that with the communication about the educational component, and they all kind of work together. But I think it's having that consistency, as I talked about in the last question, is what is that regular cadence or rhythm, whether it's monthly, and what's the medium as well? Is it, I think there's a variety of ways that you can communicate, and so often I think finance professionals in particular are guilty of this, where they'll say, hey, we're going to put out this 300-page budget book, and that's our definition of communicating well. Well, the reality is there's not a lot of stakeholders that are actually going to go through 300 plus pages of financial data. And so how do you make sure that the regular rhythm and cadence can hit a wide variety? So it might be for some a 300-page budget book or audit finding. It might be a one-pager for others. It might be email or video communication. I've seen some great states that have put forward finance videos that simplistically can walk through what is school finance all about and make it really palatable. That's another great medium that can be used. So I just think finding different ways and doing it consistently. Again, it's going to depend on the specific district and knowing your district on how much information and in what formats are they looking for it. I think another piece is really understanding, and so many school districts are guilty of this. I saw when I worked on the school board, certainly in my career of school finance, is that because we get busy in so many different other things in school districts and finance in particular, we don't start communicating about important things like elections or budget concerns, maybe budget cuts, until we're right in front of it. And so I think it's really important. I've seen it really successful with school districts that are communicating well in front of it. So a lot of school districts will have a 5-year plan for finances. And how do you make sure that you're regularly updating school districts around what that looks like, so they're in tune a year, 2 years ahead in terms of budget cuts, or maybe we need to go out and ask the community for additional dollars, and they have that so much ahead of time that they're ready for it, and it's just part of the normal rhythm for that. And then the other thing that I would say is once that season is over, whether it's an election, whether it's a budget problem that needs to be solved or gap that needs to be solved, how do we continue to communicate after the fact? I've had success with some of the school districts I've worked with in working and partnering with the communication department on big bond issues for facilities. And we did a ton of great messaging up before the bond election. And once it was passed, then we came along afterwards and we continued to update the community on the investment that they made and what happened with that. What were some of the actual results of the building or the maintenance, the deferred maintenance for those buildings? What are those tax dollars or those additional dollars that the community supported actually going towards? And so I think that regular rhythm of communicating, where are the dollars going? How are they being utilized? How does that, again, going back to the why, how does it actually impact students, the student experience, whether it be the learning or the facilities or whatever it is that is impacting, but really making sure that you're doing that post communication as well.
That's exactly right. Thank you, Ron. Let's talk a little bit, I want to throw this to Julie. Let's talk a little bit about how a lot of districts are communicating in order to comply with requirements in their state or recommendations of their professional organization. But Julie, what are some effective ways to go above and beyond those requirements to make sure that communities actually understand our finances?
Yes, I think I've dashed a lot of hopes of finance directors and departments through the years of telling them the hard facts that people are not really reading their 300-page documents that Ron mentioned, or spending a lot of time on their financial transparency websites. And they win awards for those things, and it certainly has a place. And that I know it represents so much hard work. There's so much planning that goes into it. But when you stop and think about our going from compliance to more of a comprehensive approach and a strategic approach to educating and engaging, that's what I think about when I think about budgets. And we've not done that well throughout at least my 3 decades of communications. I see a lot of districts come in, as Ron mentioned, and they either communicate right before an election, they're asking for money, or only at the time when the budget's about to be adopted, and there's no context and information like Bob's talking about to provide there. And so I think you have to think about it being year round. We've done better with this with bond elections. We realize that you have to talk about facility planning and community engagement and the recommendations of a committee. Then you talk about the election and all the facts. And then afterwards, you talk about how you're using the money that they've entrusted to you and voted into place to make the facilities happen. I think we have to think of the budget calendar the same way. It's a year-round process. And I know people like Ron and in school districts, they work year round on a budget calendar, and you need to talk about that process. I think you need to give that context to people, and you need to make it a part of your regular vocabulary. It could be a story about transportation, but you might talk about the impact that funding has on transportation, how much it costs to transport one child, those types of things. So I think layering in, as Bob talked about, layering in that messaging, there are, believe it or not, there are people that go and they want to dig deep in the weeds into the 300-page documents and into the financial transparency websites and the compliance issues and things like that. So there will be people in your community that want to engage in that way. But the majority of folks just want to know, what do I need to know about this and why does it apply to me? And I think if we look at it that way and we layer that messaging in all year, I think they need to know how we're spending, first of all, how much we get in local, state, and federal funding. I think a lot of people think school districts get a lot more federal funding than they do. They're kind of shocked sometimes how little that some districts get. And then yet others really heavily rely on their state and federal funding, and they're not really utilizing as much of the local funding. So I think that's not commonly understood to folks. So getting terminology, we did this in school safety, Nicole, where we started talking about common standard protocols across the nation, so that when you were in Illinois and you talked about a lockout, you knew what that meant when you're also in Texas or in Missouri or other places. And so I think we need common terminology. While there are differences and nuances state to state, from district to district within a state, I think there's an opportunity to even partner up with some of the districts around you, either regionally or locally, and those neighboring around you, and come up with a comprehensive strategic plan to communicate school finance issues. And I'm excited that we're doing that with some of our clients. Some of our CESO clients are going beyond compliance, and they're going beyond financial transparency websites to allow us to look at messaging. I call it the 4 T's. I'll explain that for a minute, but the 4 T's are targeting, timing, tone, and turf. And you want to use all the tools available to you by identifying which audiences need specific messages. And this is not rocket science, but a lot of times people just put out a budget message and expect it to excite everybody, and it doesn't even apply to everybody. So think about messaging that you might need to give to a pre-K parent, or messaging that you might give non-English speaking families or senior citizen voters. Those messages are different. The information they need is different. How it impacts them is different. Why it's important is different. So I think we have to target those messages to the correct audiences. And we do that a lot strategically in the communications division. This is where that partnership with the finance division can become so powerful, because you can showcase and get the messaging to those right audiences. When you think about the timing, you can get in cycles of communicating so much, like the sky is falling and dire circumstances with funding and budgets and things like that, that people actually can get some fatigue. They get a little bit of finance fatigue. And I think we probably are on the opposite side of that, where people don't hear much about school budgets, and we need to kind of step it up a little bit and consider other times throughout the year. But there are times, and we had this happen in the district I was working in. People were like, enough already with the finance situation. We had to take a little break. We had to give them some, really concentrate on some other things, because that can become your world, as Ron knows, when you're in the middle of it. And if you have funding issues, or you have shortages, or you're looking at budget cuts or layoffs, it does become the filter from which you're making a lot of your decisions. And you can get some pushback, some fatigue from individuals. I think then you got to think about the tone. We spend a lot of time talking about branding and your brand identity and who you are. And that's what I'm excited about in these finance projects we're working on right now, because we have 3 or 4 different districts right here in Texas. We have 3 or 4 different districts that are about to launch campaigns, and they are unique to their brand. They resonate. They will resonate with their community. They have different target audiences and different target messages. And just one example is, one district has a balanced budget and has put savings back for a time that it needed it. And so their messaging is very different. Another district has 75% of its families are renters, who don't even think that paying taxes impacts them, right? Because they're renters. And so that messaging it's been challenging to go out and find out ways that we can reach out to them. But you want to speak with the right tone and voice. You don't want to cause alarm, but if you're going through budget cuts, or, God forbid, there's missing money. I think we've dealt with that before, either a related, booster club, PTO member, volunteer, something happens, or there's an accounting error, someone makes a mistake. You find out you have less money than you projected you were going to have. All of us have kind of gone through those types of things, and you want to reassure people, but you also want to be transparent, and you want to speak with your district brand and your voice and reassure people. So that tone becomes very important. And then I think TURF just kind of refers to, how are you going to get this message out? You may have some parents who are millennial parents that they might, be picking up their messages in other ways, on Instagram or through digital ad campaigns or different things like that. Billboards, and you have families that email is their primary means to get it. We have others that were like, I'll go search for it online and see what I can find out. So I think if you have to go to where your audience is, so that their TURF, find out where your target audience gets their information from the district, the reliable, factual information. And then I think you got to meet them there. So, we may not want to admit it, but a lot of that's next door and on social media. So they're in these chat groups, and they're all chatting about the school budget, and they have, as Ron mentioned, sometimes it's misinformation. And so you want them to have the facts, and you want them to have the right information if they're going to talk about it. And so there are ways to build ambassadors that can be in Nextdoor and can be in some of those apps, and people that you work all year long to inform them about the budget, and they're knowledgeable. And when people say things on these platforms that's not true, these ambassadors or these people, these advocates for public ed, can step in and say, actually, I was a part of a committee, or I was a part of a presentation where I heard the facts, and help point people back to us as the reliable source. Another thing I think going above and beyond is including your students. We have really been elevating student voice across the nation over the last several years. And I think any opportunity you can have to have your students help tell the story, whether that's some of your debate or speech kids delivering some of the message by video, or, you've seen Kid President. Everybody loves a cute smiling kid. What if he stopped to explain the difference between maintenance and operations and INS, or interest and sinking? So it's a good opportunity to teach financial literacy in families and in the terminology, but you can use your students to do that. I think the key point, and we would say this as communicators, and really stress this with the departments that we work with, whether it's finance or HR or academic departments, is that it has to be two-way communications. You can't just put a message out and expect that everybody understood it. There has to be ongoing dialogue. And I think people that go above and beyond what the requirements are in the state for having financial transparency websites or producing your audits online or whatever it is your state requires, I think that's a district that has real authentic engagement and really educates and engages people in the decisions that are going to impact them, and especially financial decisions. And then look for experts outside the field. I've heard of a lot of, Ron mentioned committees. A lot of districts will put finance committees together. I would not recommend these being voting, kind of those type of power committees, but advisory committees, it can be very, very helpful. And if you're in a community where you can tap into some of the resources of investors or people in the marketing field or people that are in financial advisement and things like that, put a committee together, teach them more about school finance and school budgeting, and allow them to help make recommendations. We can learn a lot from the industries outside of education and vice versa. And so I think you have an opportunity to do that. Some people will put they're kind of like a key communicators group together, and they meet all year. Definitely make finance one of those presentations and give them the opportunity to understand the school budget, and then look for ways all year long. Let's say you're talking about the special ed programs coming in and they're presenting, talk about the cost to hire special ed teachers, the support services that are needed, the additional funding you get when students need care and modifications. And I think those are all opportunities that you can weave the finance story into regular stories. That's just a few examples that come to mind.
That's a good point. And when we're talking about the various requirements that different states have, it's interesting. I know that you were talking about financial transparency websites in Texas, where you are. That's a requirement, but those website requirements for those financial transparency sites don't necessarily provide everything that somebody's going to need to understand it. So, which is why you're going above and beyond to do these additional sites for people.
Exactly. In fact, unfortunately, like websites all across the nation have become too often, they kind of become a dumping ground. It's a page where they put PDFs for the last 10, 15 years, thinking that if people want the answer, they can go look for it there. But that's not really marketing your message. That's not really targeting your message. And that's where the partnership between communications folks like us and finance folks like Ron in your district can become so powerful, because they have the knowledge financially. We have the ability to find the communication tools and the messaging to market that message and get it to the intended audiences, but also to listen and learn and get the feedback and to share it. And so you don't want it just to become a page of links that nobody's actually going to. I think that's how I break people's hearts, by saying, go look at your analytics. The last time somebody looked at this was a year and a half ago, and they're like crushed. But it wins awards, and it's important because it's there. But I think we've got to be much more intentional going forward, especially in the climate that we're in. I think the climate we're in is not just to automatically trust educators, to automatically trust the government. That's not the climate we're in nearly anywhere in the United States right now. And and I can remember when, if the school said it, then parents believed it, right? And taxpayers believed it. That's not always the case. They may trust but verify, and they want us to be able to show them and not just tell them. But also, I think if they want to dig deeper, you got to make yourself available and get them in front of the experts. If they really want to get down in the weeds and they want to look through 10 or 15 years of audits, have at it. We can put you in touch with somebody that could speak your love language. But I think for most people, they're busy parents. We need to layer in the messaging. We need to go to where they are, and we need to make it as simple as possible. And then if they have more questions or they need more information, we cannot get defensive. We've got to look at that as an opportunity, I think, to engage with them and collect that feedback.
Absolutely. Well, Julie, you and I are both big fans of the 4-step communication planning process. And one of the essential steps there is research. That's the first thing. When it comes to financial communication, that means listening to people. You're kind of touching on that before. what are some proven strategies and tactics for engaging with constituents about finances?
Well, I think one thing that I probably should really point out that shouldn't have to be said, but too often it does, is that your most important audience, first of all, when you're researching how to get this information out, is to look at your internal audiences, your staff especially. I think that if we could explain and help teachers, classroom teachers, administrators, campus principals, these are some really trusted people in our district, and families look to them. And if they ask them questions about the budget and our own employees don't know it, or they don't understand it, or they don't trust it, if they don't trust the information they have, we've got a real problem. So I think as part of your research, I think you need to think about your internal communications first. It's important to keep your employees apprised of what's happening, especially because a lot of times your budget decisions are impacting them first, even more so than the student, especially if you get in a climate where you have to make budget cuts. A lot of times we try all that we can do, as you can imagine, to keep it away from the classroom. And so a lot of times there are administrative cuts, there's staffing cuts, there's adding additional prep time to teachers, there's taking away things that they've had before, there's cutting things out of the budget they've come to rely on. And so when you start thinking about, if you've ever gone through those kind of cuts, and I know everybody on the screen has, it's just a real opportunity for you to get face-to-face. And it's not always good news you have to deliver. Sometimes it's out of your control. Sometimes it's because of some mistake or some misstep along the way. But a lot of times it is out of your control. It's because of funding formulas and the way the state does school finance, and not well. I'll add that in sometimes. In a lot of states, we're not providing the type of funding that we need to for kids to have the kind of education that parents in the community come to expect of us. And we don't have the funding to be able to do that. And it seems to be becoming more and more of an issue. But I think not only are employees go-to sources, but I also think you can test some of your messaging with them. If you can help them understand it and they can explain it to someone else, then you're probably ready for a more public sharing of that information. I think when you're researching, you can't just be looking for information or asking for feedback. You have to really, truly listen. I want to give an example of that because I was involved in a process that was two-way engagement. And thankfully, my superintendent at the time really listened about the engagement part. We went out to every campus and we made budget presentations. There was consistent messaging no matter who gave that presentation. Then we sat down with the employees and we basically told them, we've got a problem. We've got to cut the budget because of some state funding issues, lack of state funding issues. And we asked them to give their input and their feedback. And we gave them 2 colored sticky notes. It seems super simple, but one was for revenue enhancement ideas and one was for budget reduction ideas. And they were allowed to write anything that they could come to mind. And as you can imagine, we got some pretty interesting suggestions sometimes. Something that seems so minute as, well, teachers could bring their own coffee to school. And we didn't discount anything. We put everything into a spreadsheet. And then there were things that we had to go back to explain to people. Like I think one time the bus driver said, let's charge people to drive onto our property and drop their kids off at school. Well, you're not allowed to do that, at least in my state. And so we had to say, well, that would be a great idea and probably would generate us a lot of money every day, except for it's not allowed. So sometimes it's an opportunity when you get feedback and an idea might be a little absurd, but it's an opportunity to explain why districts can't do what they're suggesting, but they feel heard. And so we took all of those ideas, we put it into spreadsheets, then we went back to the campuses, told them what they told us, what we heard, and then let them rank. And the one thing I think we did that was smart, and I don't know how we came up with this, but I give it as advice to people, is we didn't let like the middle school cut the high school things or the elementary cut special ed or athletics cut fine arts. You were only allowed to make recommendations and cuts or enhancements in your own division or your own department. That really gave ownership, and it also kept people from pointing fingers elsewhere. How can we be a part of this solution? What can we bring to the table? We had a lot of really great ideas, and we even took those ideas to the community in a form of a survey, and we were going to, our finance department and our administration had decided, we'll stop paying for transportation. That's not a requirement in the state of Texas for us to get your child to school. And it might be different in other places besides special education students. So we can cut general transportation for everybody. And our family said, whoa, no way. And we did surveys and it came back very strongly. We would rather pay for a bus pass than lose transportation altogether. And we took that information, we took it back to the school board and they said, okay, instead of cutting our busing services, which as you can imagine would lay off our drivers, but we were going to sell buses, do all those things. Instead of doing that, we went back and instituted a pay to ride. And then the family said, well, if we have multiple kids though, that's too much money. We can't do that. Well, what about a family cap? All of those ideas came out of authentic engagement with our community and ideas that came out of our community. You can put committees together. We had a revenue enhancement committee. They came up with 22 pages of ideas of how to raise money. And some of them were not things that the school district was willing to do, but others of them were. And we put a lot of those things in place based on that short-term ad hoc committee. So there's lots of different ways when you're researching focus groups, surveys. You just want to make sure that you're getting a representation of diverse voices in your community. So you don't want to just talk to the athletic parents. You don't want to just talk to, a certain ethnicity or a certain age parent or taxpayer. You want to make sure you have a cross section of your community and you're listening to the people that are going to be impacted. But I think those are great opportunities to do some research, to get out there. You can look at everything for what your budget trends are. I love a deep dive with our finance folks. I may be a little weird like that, but I love to get in there and start looking, hey, did you notice this? And I was working with the district the other day that noticed that 10 of their pre-K kids didn't go on to register for kindergarten. And when it was first brought up in the district, it was sort of like, well, that's 10 kids. Okay, but 10 kids times $6,160 in our state times 12 years that you've now lost them past pre-K is in the upwards of $860,000. I think I got that wrong. You might check my math, but it's like $860,000. And all of a sudden you talk about 10 kids equating to a lot of teachers, a lot of budget cuts if that revenue doesn't come in. So when you start looking at attendance and things that impact your budget, you have to give that context that Bob was talking about to say, did you know that when your child misses 2 days every month, you miss this much instruction? And not only that, we lose this much in funding. People say, oh, well, my kid's just a dollar figure to you. No, but your child requires a teacher, a campus principal, a counselor, a nurse. That does equate. So money does matter, and it helps us to provide the services that kids need. So, and I think one more thing that I want to point out before I forget this is that we really have to watch the political ramifications and the climate in our community. When you're doing your research, you can get into voter trends. You can get into, a little bit of that. You want to stay as much of a centrist as possible, understanding that certain terminologies are certain things you propose, whether that's a tax increase or other things in your budget, can get a response that's a partisan response, and you can find yourself kind of in a back and forth in some of that political rhetoric that we've seen across the nation, whether it's what curriculum you're buying or other things. But so you have to be very careful that, again, your tone, your voice, everything stays true to your brand. This is when you're engaging your community, then you actually understand this is the way this information needs to be presented. And there are certain words, jargon, buzzwords that we want to avoid because they tend to be red flags that put this into a context that becomes political. And I think that's actually what's hurting us in school finance and public ed across the nation right now. So try not to take a political stance on what you're doing, but if you decide to do that, and if you do that in a way, calling on, for instance, more funding for public ed, or if your district's going to come out against charter schools, anything like that, I think you have to be very well aware of the ramifications of that. Dialogue will start, and it becomes very, very important that you know your community, you know your voters, and you know what that response will be like.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Thank you all. I'd like to give you a moment. I saw you all listening intently to each other. Do any of you have anything you want to respond to that one of the other panelists brought up?
I just want to emphasize Julie's comment about internal. I was thinking about that. And I think that's absolutely critical. Oftentimes, when we think about finance communications, we think about bond referendums and levy. We think externally, which is very important, but we don't often think about our own staff, our teachers, and how important it is that they know what we're talking about. And I think that's a really, really critical point in all this is to, as we often advise, start internal. And I think in terms of your finance communications, starting internal and making sure your staff is well informed is very good advice.
And I'll just piggyback off that. The other thing that Julie had talked about is having ambassadors out in the community. And I was thinking, it's easy for, as a finance person, to say, well, that's why I have my Citizen Finance Advisory Committee. Typically, those are smaller groups. And I'm thinking even of your employees, in particular your teachers, if they are armed with data and information and the talking points, oftentimes those folks live right in the community that they're serving in. And what a great way to have ambassadors out there if you can bring them into the conversation, make sure that you are presenting to them in an understandable way, and they can take those messages out to the community.
Yeah.
Nicole, I know I just finished talking, but I thought of two more things. One being that you have non-parents out there. And so we've talked to a lot of clients and we ask them, what are you sending out about your budget and financial information to the taxpayers that are out there that are not parents in your district? And this has gotten worse, I think, since pandemic years and in post-pandemic times when a lot of things got closed down and we started canceling things. A lot of things didn't get opened back up to the non-parents, and we changed some things the way we do things at campuses or the invites that we send out. It just got easier not to do it. And I think you need to be having a communication to your non-parents that doesn't require them to jump on a website and look for it themselves. You need to market your financial information. And a lot of times that's good news. A lot of times you've won a financial awards, you've got financial stability, there's good decision making. It's not always dire news or about budget cuts. And so I think that you need to find ways, and we are working with our clients to do that, to make sure that we're mailing things or sending them something with a QR, the rebirth of a QR code after the pandemic. Who knew? But QR codes now to send them to websites and get them messaging that you want. And I think that, I just think that becomes very, very important. And that non-parent audience. And then I think another thing that I was thinking about is not waiting too long. I think if you are sitting on information that trouble's coming, and I'm thinking of a few clients that we're working with on this, is that they would like to wait, hoping that the situation is going to get better, and you just feel like it's time. It's time to be transparent. It's time to step up, even if you have to be the deliverer of bad news. Or, hopefully you have solutions to come when you share the problems, but, don't sit on that information waiting and wondering if someone's going to find out. It's always best to tell your story first and to own your own narrative rather than to have somebody share even a false narrative or an inaccurate narrative and you're on the defense. So I always say, when you can tell people the bad news, tell it to them yourself and show accountability. And I remember, I'll never forget, I was working in a district where there was some money missing and we could not account for it. And it was not a lot of money, but the CFO of my district walked in and said, I'm calling the police in and I'm going to ask them to investigate. That includes me. And they traced the money back. And ironically, it ended up being someone that was taking the money when the deposits were made at the bank. But none of us knew that. And for him to walk in and said, investigate me, I thought that was so powerful. We put out a letter and said, we're calling for an independent investigation. We've notified the police. We're going to track this money down. We're going to hold people accountable. And it ended up not being us. So that story was even great to tell, but it was happening and it was our tax dollars. And so that's just an example of just ethically doing the right thing when you've got bad news to share.
That's exactly right. That's a good point. Thank you all so much for your time. Oh,
I just want to add one more
thing.
I just want to add one more thing, Nicole. As I was listening to Julie, another audience or another purpose here is keeping our local, our families and our local staff informed. So when they hear things from legislators or government officials that are often not accurate or part of the story, they can bring that back to their community and say, wait a minute, that doesn't seem quite right, because we have lots of folks who like to hyperbole and do some say some crazy things, and if we have our own folks better informed, it just helps to balance some of that rhetoric that comes from other places.
That's a good point. They can be, like Julie called them, good ambassadors to clarify things. Exactly. Thank you all so much for your time today. I think this has been a really powerful episode, and so I appreciate you bringing your time and expertise. Thanks to everyone who listened in and who will be listening in to this in the future. I hope you'll also join us for our next live episode. We'll be announcing that soon, but sneak preview, it's going to be a special edition of Ask CESO Communications, where it'll be our book club episode where we share books that have made a difference for our work. So if you would like to hear more about that, watch for our social feeds and our newsletter. And if you'd like to be added to our newsletter list, or if you have a book recommendation that you'd like us to shout out in that episode, please give me an email at nicole.kirby@theceso.com. If you'd like to learn more about CESO and all the services we offer to school districts, including communications, go to theceso.com. And if you'd like to talk to us about providing communication support in your district, contact Bob here. His information's on the screen, or any of us on the team. Thanks so much.
Bye.